if you have the little companion guide that we've created this week, we'll start taking notes on page 5. So we're on page 5 this week. And then also we'll be having sort of there's an accompanying graphic in the back, page 14 and 15, that will go along with this that we'll talk about later. I want to start off with one question for you this morning. Have you ever been going through life and all of a sudden you just felt this overwhelming urge, like I should be doing something else? Now, maybe you, at the moment, you chalked it up to like this craziness in the back of your mind, like, oh, well, that's silliness. Like, why would I do that? But you can't get away from this, almost like this voice that's kind of keep repeating itself to you in your mind. Like, I should be doing this and not that. Now, maybe it's something small. Like, maybe I need to be doing this one thing in terms of like with my life. Like, this is life calling. I need to be doing this. And maybe it's just like I shouldn't be like cheating on my taxes. Or maybe I shouldn't be doing this thing that deep down inside I know is wrong. And we can call that sort of a still small voice in the back of our heads. We can call that the voice of our conscience. Or what I think is probably the most apt is that God is speaking to us in very distinct ways, leading us and guiding us to do what He has called for us to do. Sometimes that speaking comes in very small ways. Sometimes it comes through doing what we know is right deep down inside. And sometimes that voice leads us and is calling us to do some very extraordinary things that we never would have thought that we were capable of doing before. As we continue in our series on the book of Exodus, turn with me to Exodus chapter 3. This morning we're going to learn about this man who, throughout his life, God has been preparing him. A man named Moses. If you were with us last week, we learned about the Israelites and how they were living in the land of Egypt. They were living far away from the land that God had promised to them. And over the years, the Pharaoh enslaves them, persecutes them. They're going through all sorts of hardships. And it gets to the point where where Pharaoh even says, like, why don't we just kill all of these Israelite male children? Because he's afraid of them. But one little boy, along with a whole host of Israelites, is spared. But one child, we see the beginning of how God directs one baby's life, one child's life, who floats down a river in the Nile, who is raised in Pharaoh's household, who commits a murder and runs for his life to a place far away, and now he encounters God on this mountain. He's out shepherding his family's flock. His father-in-law's flock. He's out shepherding, and he sees something, and he begins to say, now, what is that? I have to go explore that more. And the closer he gets, the more he sees this bush that isn't consumed by the fire. And in the midst of that bush, he sees God. He encounters God, probably for the first time in his life. Because we never see God talking to Moses before, but now he comes face to face with God, and God is calling him to do something. Exodus chapter 3, starting in verse 7. The Lord said, I have indeed seen the misery of my people in Egypt. So I have seen. He says, I have heard them crying out because of their slave drivers, and I am concerned about their suffering. So God has seen, God has heard, and God is concerned about his people that are living in the land of Egypt. So, this is what I've decided to do. I've come down to rescue them from the land of the Egyptians and to bring them out of that land into a good and spacious land, a land flowing with milk and honey, the home of the Canaanites, Hittites, Amorites, Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites. Now, did God all of a sudden I never noticed this for 400 years? No, that's not what God's saying. But now he has especially prepared Moses for this task of freeing his people. The time has been just the right time for this grand redemption, this grand journey to freedom that he is about to lead his people on. So it's just the right time for the Israelites. And he says, listen, I'm sending you. And now the cry of the Israelites has reached me, and I have seen the way the Egyptians are oppressing them. So now go. I am sending you to Pharaoh to bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt. Now, imagine being asked to do something and you see the enormity of the task. And you're like, how in the world am I ever going to do this? Like, I feel ill-prepared. Like, I see the size. I see almost the impossibility of what God is asking me to do. Now what? Now, if you have children, if you've interacted with children at all, if you've ever asked them to do something, do children obey the first time? Oh, no. Mine is like, but I'm tired. Like, they have boundless energy, but at that moment, they're all of a sudden exhausted. And they start coming up with excuses like why they can't. No doubt Moses understands the enormity of the task that he's been called to do. And this is what he begins to say. He begins to say this in verse 11. But Moses said to God, who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt? Now, in many ways, this is a natural response for Moses. Who am I? I'm a nobody. Why me? I'm just a shepherd. I've been tending flock for decades. In fact, I'm on the run from the Egyptians. I've killed an Egyptian down there. Why me? Why are you sending me? And God's response is this. He says, and God said, he says, I will be with you. And this will be the sign to you that it is I who have sent you. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you will worship God on this mountain. Now, the mountain he's talking about is Mount Sinai. So Moses was to go down to Egypt, tell Pharaoh, hey, by the way, all this slave labor you have, we're just going to go and leave. We're out of here. Thank you for all you've done, and we're out of here. And then he was to lead this massive amount of people back to Mount Sinai where they would encounter God. Easy task, right? No problem. And God says, listen, I understand how big what I'm asking you to do is. He says, no worries, though, I am with you. Now, just pause for a second there. We don't understand the enormity of what God has just said to them. In that culture, the idea that a God is with you no matter where you go was completely foreign. The gods of Egypt had power in Egypt. The gods of Canaan had power in Canaan. And so the idea that God would say, no matter where you go, like, I'm not just the God of this mountain. I'm not just the God of the Sinai Peninsula. Like, I'm the God of Egypt and the God of Canaan and the God of the whole world. And it doesn't matter where you go, I will be with you. We don't serve this regional God. We serve this God who is the creator and sustainer of everything. And so he tells Moses, like, listen, it's not because you're all that. It's not because you're amazing that I'm sending you. But I have specifically prepared you for this moment. All that time you spent in Pharaoh's household, getting to know the language, getting to know the culture, getting to know the people. Like, I have been preparing you your whole life to do this task that I'm asking you to do. Now, Moses' next thing comes a couple sentences later. In verse 13, Moses said to God, now suppose I go to the Israelites and say to them, the God of your fathers has sent me to you, and they ask me, what is his name? Then what should I tell them? So the next thing is like, what if the people doubt me? Okay, so I get it. You'll be with me. But what if I go there, like, who's going to tell the Israelites this? Again, Moses has been detached from his people for decades. He grew up in Pharaoh's household. It's not like he's had this close relationship. It's not like he would have been seen as a natural leader among his people. And God begins to say, no, you want to know my name. And the literal name that he gives them is Yahweh. I am who I am. I will be who I will be. He says, that's my name. And he says more than that. He says, like, I am the God of Abraham and the God of Isaac and the God of Jacob. He puts his name into this relational, historical context. He's like, all of your ancestors, all of the patriarchs, like I've been with them as well. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, those stories you've been telling you, like, don't fret. I am your God. I am still your God. And I'm going to work in some miraculous ways in the life of Israel. Don't doubt. Now, his next response comes in chapter 4, verse 1. So God is telling Moses all of these things. And Moses answered, what if they do not believe me or listen to me and say, the Lord did not appear to you? Now, in many ways, this is not just for Israel. This is for Pharaoh, the Egyptians as well. Like, okay, I get it. I'm equipped. Like, you've talked to me, and I'm going to tell them all these things. But, like, what if they still doubt? What if they still don't believe me? And God gives to Moses these signs. He says, all right, see that staff in your hand? I want you to throw it on the ground. And what happens is that the rod becomes a snake. And then God says, all right, now pick it back up again. And so Moses picks it up again, and it becomes this rod. It becomes the staff again. And God says, oh, why don't you put your hand in your cloak? Put it in your cloak. So Moses does that, and he pulls it back out, and it's leprous. There's this skin disease, right? And he reverses, he puts it in again, and it comes out clean again. So God says, listen, if they don't believe you, I'm going to give you these signs. I'm going to give these things for you to do so that they will know and they will understand through seeing these signs that I am God and that I am with you. Now imagine being Moses and these amazing things have just happened. Like your natural response is, oh man, I've got some power behind me now. Like these aren't just words, these are actions as well. And yet Moses says this in verse 10. Moses said to the Lord, pardon your servant, Lord, I have never been eloquent. Neither in the past nor since you have spoken to your servant. I am slow of speech and tongue. Have you ever been called to do something or felt you should do something and you're like, you start making excuses why you can't? Moses says, listen, I'm not a gifted orator. I'm not good at talking. Like, I get nervous, my palms get all sweaty, and like I stutter, and like I'm going to go to Pharaoh, the most powerful man in the world, and I'm going to tell him like, hey, we're out of here. Even with these things that you've given me, even this name, like, I don't know, God. Are you sure you have the right person? And God repeats, like, listen, I will be with you. The God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the God who was with them is also with you. Don't worry about your own inability. I will give you the words that you are to say. So, all of these times now, Moses has come up with an excuse of why he can't, and God has assured him why you can. And finally, Moses just said, send someone else. I'm rejecting this call that you have on my life. I won't do it, God. Now, I think we naturally say to ourselves, like, well, I mean, how dare Moses, right? How dare you reject the call of God? And yet, I wonder how many times in our own lives we felt that voice speaking to us of something that we should be doing, and we just kept pushing it off and pushing it off and pushing it off. Like, I won't, I won't, I won't. So finally, God, like in his frustration, says, fine. I'm still going to send you, but I'll bring Aaron, and Aaron will be my mouthpiece. And there are some consequences for this as well, because Aaron then and his family become the high priest. There are some consequences for Moses' disobedience. And finally, Moses relents. He's like, "Oh, okay, I'll go, like, you're sending me with Aaron." Now, the interesting thing is, Moses does assume the role of mouthpiece. God does indeed speak through Moses. So somewhere along the way, Moses accepts this divine call in his life. And he goes before Pharaoh. And he says, "Let my people go. Like, we're going to go out in the mountain. We're going to go out and worship." And we see this in chapter 5, verse 1. It says, afterwards, so they've returned to Egypt. Moses and Aaron have returned to Egypt. It says, afterwards, Moses and Aaron went to Pharaoh and said, "This is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. Let my people go, that they may hold a festival to me in the wilderness." And Pharaoh said, "Who is the Lord, that I should obey him and let Israel go? I do not know the Lord, and I will not let Israel go." Like, his reaction is very natural, like, "I don't know this God that you talk of. Like, I've heard of some of these other gods in other lands, but that's not any God in Egypt." Like, God's controlled everything. The harvest, the sun, the moon, the stars, the frogs, the river. They thought that there was a God almost in control of everything. And they prayed to these gods, and they knew their names. And Pharaoh naturally says, like I didn't learn that one in elementary school. I didn't learn about your God at religious Sunday school class. Or I don't know who that is. And you know what? I don't really care, because if this is the God of this enslaved people, why should I care about him? What has this God ever done? And it's interesting that God begins to make himself known in the life of Egypt. We see Moses casting down the staff, and the Egyptian magicians come in and they do something similar. It's a magic trick. And what happens is the staff of Moses eats the staff of these other magicians. God is showing his power over the gods of Egypt, over the magicians and their powers. And Moses does all of these other things, and what we see is that Pharaoh still doesn't believe. And in fact, it says he hardens his heart to what Moses is saying. He hardens his heart to these plagues. And 10 different times, God sends a plague on Egypt. And 9 of those times, Pharaoh initially says, like, "Okay, I relent. Like, this is too much. Like, the frogs and the boils and everything, like, it's too much. Like, I relent." And then it says he changes his heart. He hardens his heart and changes his mind. And Moses comes and says, "All right, we're ready to go." And Pharaoh says, No, I changed my mind overnight. So there's a plague. It wreaks havoc. Pharaoh says, "Okay, you can go." Pharaoh changes his mind, and there's another plague. And this cycle just keeps repeating itself. Now, it's interesting, and you can see all of this on pages 14 and 15, the plagues, and also something else. On page 15, you see each one of these plagues, there's not just some random plague, some random disaster that is God like, "Okay, what can I do now?" Each one of these plagues is God saying, "So the God of the sun, your sun God that you worship, I'm showing my power over him. And this God of the Nile, and this God of the frogs, and this God of all of these different gods that you have in your life, like, I'm going to make myself known to you by showing you my power over them." In other words, this God, this idol that you have been worshiping cannot save you. Like, my desire is to make myself known to you, Pharaoh. Like, you don't know my name, but I'm going to tell you. I'm going to show you so that you'll know. And this happens time and time again. The cycle repeats itself. Pharaoh hardens his heart for the first 5 times. And then there's something interesting that happens. It goes from Pharaoh hardening his heart. Now, hardening was not like a compassion thing. Hardening was like a determination, like, I will do this. So when it says Pharaoh hardens his heart, there's like this determinism. Like, I in my will am choosing that, like, I'm not going to let the Israelites go. Like, no. There's this pig-headedness, if you will. Even so much that Pharaoh's advisors even think Pharaoh's nuts. Like, they can't understand why he's doing this. And then the last 5, it says this, that God hardens Pharaoh's heart. Now again, this is just God saying, all right, listen, you are so determined. I'm going to give you your extra little bit of strength to make that determination. In many ways, this too was an assault on one of the gods of Egypt. So we've had all of the plagues that were assaults on all of these different gods. And now Pharaoh himself was considered a god in Egypt, someone worthy of worship. And God says, listen, I even have power and control over you. Like, I'm going to strengthen you. I'm going to show you, you think you have this free will, and I'm going to show you that I have power over you. In essence, I have power over this God. And ultimately, this hardening, this cycle of hardening leads to Pharaoh's destruction. The destruction of every firstborn male in Egypt. I'm not going to have everybody stand, but if you are a firstborn male, imagine as punishment your death. Not just humans, but livestock. All of Egypt suffers this punishment, suffers under the hands of this God. God saying, I have power over you. I want to bring up 3 things this morning as we look at the ways that Exodus intersects with our own lives. The way that these stories are, in many ways, our stories. The very first thing is this: God desires to make himself known. Paul says in the book of Romans, says God has made himself known in all of creation. All his qualities, his attributes. It says God has made himself known in creation so that everyone can worship him. God is constantly revealing himself to people. He is revealing himself to Israelites in a whole new way with this story. We'll see that how he guides them to Mount Sinai and he reveals to them the law. And it was for a purpose, not so that they could sort of keep it to themselves, but so that through them God would make himself known. God desires to make himself known in this world. Through cultures, through people, through whatever. God wants to reveal himself. It's not like this grand secret. God earnestly wants all people to know him. And here's the thing, that God uses people to bring about his plan. In that context, it was the Israelites. It was Moses. He says, listen, I want to use you, Moses, to bring about my plan. He brings the Israelites out and says, I want to use you, Israelites, to bring about your plan. After Christ, he says, I want to use you, disciples, to bring about my plan. And he speaks to every one of us as well. I want to use you to bring about my plan. I want to use ordinary people in extraordinary ways to bring about my plan. We talk about what's my purpose in life. To make God known in your own little worlds. God is calling each one of you to make God known. Sometimes that may involve like a direct call to go become a missionary somewhere. Maybe that's a direct call to be a faithful witness in the community for children. Maybe it's to go across the room at work and to just pray for someone. and to talk to them about Jesus, to talk about God. But God wants to make himself known, and we as a community of believers are tasked with saying, by the way, this is God working. By the way, this is God working. By the way, this is God working. Helping people see the ways that God is working in our worlds. God wants to use us, people with a purpose to bring about his plan. We talked about that last week. God is using each one of us as we submit, as we are obedient to that call, to that still small voice in our life. And here's the great thing. It's not because we're awesome. Rather, it is God's strength that makes us sufficient for the assignment. Moses knew this more than anyone. Like, I'm not well-spoken. Like, I'm not well-gifted. God, why are you calling me to do this thing? God could have just as easily said, you're right. You're not well-spoken. You're not the best. You're not the brightest. But you know what? You're the person that I've tasked. And so because I have called you, I will also empower you. I will give you the right words to say to Pharaoh. I will give you these signs and wonders to do. Now, not all of us are going to be able to, like, throw down a staff and have it become a snake, right? But yet God is still speaking to us. What God has called us to do, that person that God is calling us to talk to. Maybe God is calling you to the ministry and you're like, I feel ill-equipped. I felt the same way. Like, God, why me? And yet we see this empowering in my own life. I've seen it. It doesn't mean I'm perfect. It doesn't mean I haven't messed up. It doesn't mean that I haven't at times been like Moses and rejected that call. Sometimes it means at the end of the day saying, God, like, I know I've been disobedient, but I want to obey. God, will you empower me? Will you equip me? As we look around us, if you look at your life, how has God equipped you? God has equipped you with people. He has perhaps prepared you your whole life for a certain task. Maybe you didn't even realize it at the moment. But it is God's strength that is working in you. I want to talk about a man today in our own community who God has used in an extraordinary way. I think growing up, this man never envisioned that God would use him the way that he has. 9th grade education. Grew up Amish. And yet God has used him. Even at times, God has used him, and he's felt unworthy, and he's like, well, why are you calling me? And yet God used him in the lives of a prison ministry. He served on a prison ministry board. And I think he would say it's not because I was the most gifted, because God was the one who gave me the strength. And when God called him to be a pastor here, I think Danny would agree with me. He felt, what? Here's a little Amish boy, 9th grade education, and God calls him to be a pastor. Not because he was the best or the brightest, definitely the best looking among us, but because Danny was willing to accept that call. Willing to say, God, will you give me strength? And God has used Danny in extraordinary ways. Not just in the life of this community, this church, but in the lives of prisoners, in the lives of the people that he mentors who are going through difficult times. I could just as easily go around and talk about the ways that God has gifted you, that he wants to give you strength to do what he's calling you to do. Not because you're the best, not because you're the brightest, not because I'm any of those things, but it's so that his power can be made more evident through us, through our weakness. As the worship team comes forward, I want to ask you this question this morning. 2 questions. 1, what is God calling you to do? Now, this may not look extraordinary. This may not be like a missionary to Africa type calling. But what it could be is this. I have specifically called you to a people. Maybe you work in a tax office, and God is saying, I want you to go to your fellow tax people and pray for them. Maybe you grew up in an Amish household and you have all these friends who don't know Jesus. And God is saying, listen, I have specifically equipped you throughout your entire life to meet these people and to make myself known to them. Maybe it's to your family. Maybe it is that God is calling you this morning to the ministry. Maybe it's because God is calling you to be a missionary. But maybe it's God simply saying, will you submit? Will you obey? Will you make myself known in the world around you? My question this morning is this: who are your people and what is God calling you to do? I encourage you this morning to do this. At the bottom, as you listen to God, the bottom of that page, ask yourself, who is it and what is it that God is calling me to do? How will I trust God for the strength to do this? Because I know I can't do it on my own. As you think, as you meditate, as you go throughout this week, may that question be all pervasive in your life. And may your response be, God, here I am. Use me. Will you stand as we worship?